Kia ora, everyone. My name is Andrea, as some of you will know. Welcome to everyone who has joined us in the past, and also welcome to those who are joining us for the first time here today. We have done these webinars since April now, and we have, I think, three more going into September. And I have mentioned that a few times now, or actually in every webinar, that it's part of our progressive thinking series. And in these little booklets that we usually publish, we get, usually 10 perspectives on a certain topic, and from thought leaders like Thea. And one booklet that we are still going to publish is on the future of public and community services, and all of these webinars are part of that series. But we have published 3 other booklets, so if you're interested in text, in housing, or the future of work, just check out our website and you can access them online there. So just a quick run through on how we are doing the webinar. Very, very briefly, we'll have introductions in a minute or so, and then our guest will present her chapter, and then we'll have, as always, a bit of a conversation about her ideas and her thoughts that she has put forward. And of course, as always, you can all participate in the discussion by using the question and answer function. And please post your questions there, and if possible, nice and short, because then it makes it easier to bring them into the conversation. Thea has also agreed to answer any unanswered questions afterwards. So as always, if your question remains unanswered, we'll get the question to Thea, who will answer it, and then we'll get it back to you. And also, if you're interested in previous webinars and chapters that people have contributed, you can find them all on the PSA website. I think that's probably all I want to say for now. So a very warm welcome to you, Thea.
Thank you.
Thea Snow is from the Center for Public Impact, and she has wrote her chapter in collaboration with Adrian Brown and Toby Lowe. And as always, we had a bit of a chat prior to the webinar, and I asked Thea for her 3 words that describe her work and herself in a way. And so you told me that your 3 words are complexity, relationships, and learning. So can you explain to us a little bit why you chose those words and what they express or mean for you?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. Before I do, I just want to begin, as we do in Australia, with a quick acknowledgement of country. So I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all gathered today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So it's great to be here, and to go back to those 3 words, complexity, relationships and learning, they really sit at the core of our version of reimagined government. And that's what the chapter that we've written is about, and it's really what the Centre for Public Impact is about. So we believe that government, the design of government, the values of government, the mindset that government applies and brings to the world is outdated, and that we need a reimagined form of government that's based on a recognition that the world is complex, a recognition that relationships, human relationships, matter enormously, and that progress is best made through learning and experimentation. So that's really what I'm going to be presenting on today.
That's great. Yeah, exciting. Thank you so much. So as you've all heard, we are talking about a reimagined government and what is necessary to establish a reimagined government, and as part of that, a reimagined public service. And as you said, complexity plays a major role, and you are going to address the issues of, I guess, a focus of accountability and control by using the human learning systems approach. So I think I'll just give you the floor to share some of your thoughts with us, and you'll have around about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation. So the floor is yours, Thea.
Great, thanks. So as I started to say, and I sort of didn't want to give too much away in that opening bit, because it would steal all the thunder from the talk. CPI has been exploring this vision for reimagining government for around 5 years, and we've really felt that COVID has opened up this conversation in a really quite profound way, because we're seeing governments behave in ways they don't normally behave. We're seeing community and government relationships start to shift. We're seeing deeper, stronger collaborations between government and people outside of government. And there's some really interesting work around paradigm shift and critical junctures like a crisis, like COVID, really acting as a catalyst for significant change. And that's why we're really obviously both devastated by what's happening in the world, but also thinking really hard about how this might open doorways to really activate and push forward on a reimagined form of government. So at CPI, I think that at the core of our version of reimagined government, what we describe is a shift away from a version of government that sees its role as being to control things and do things to people and deliver services to people, to a version of government which sees its core role as being to create the conditions from which good outcomes can emerge. And I think Hilary Cottam, in her book Radical Help, gives a really lovely analogy, and she says the role of public servants in the public service should shift from controlling mechanical levers to that of head gardener, tending, nurturing, planting, and where necessary, weeding. And it's that vision for government, of government and public servants as head gardener, that we're starting to push towards. And this vision is underpinned by 3 core beliefs, and they're the words that I mentioned before. So I'll just run through those in a bit more detail. The first is that the world and most of the problems that government deals with are complex, not complicated. But while government's really well set up to address complicated problems, it's not particularly well set up to address complex problems. And what I mean by complicated versus complex, I'll give some examples because I find that the easiest way to sort of get your head around these ideas. A complicated problem is something like building a road. So it's not straightforward, it's not easy. You need to involve lots of people. It's a very detailed and challenging process. But there are steps you can follow. There are rule books and manuals that set out that if you do A, then B, then C, a road will be built. And you're pretty sure that even though timelines might be delayed or things might go a little bit off kilter, you'll get there by following the rule book. A complex problem is something like obesity. And I'm not sure if people have seen obesity systems maps, but what they do is they put obesity in the middle and then they plot literally hundreds of contributory factors that influence a challenge like obesity. And they have hundreds of little arrows backwards and forwards between what they call the nodes, which show the way that you touch one bit of the system and it has flow-on effects for the rest of the system. So often complexity, an analogy for complexity, is a flock of birds, the way a flock of birds move. And it's completely unpredictable, and yet everything is interconnected with everything else, and it works. So a lot of the problems that government deals with are complex. And as I said, government is not well set up to deal with complex problems. So a key question that we pose in the essay is, how do we reorient government so that it's better placed to address complex challenges? The second element or belief that sort of underpins our vision is relationships. And again, when you're dealing with complex challenges, one of the most important tools is strong, trusting relationships between humans, because you can't predict what will happen when you intervene in the system in particular ways. So you need trust, you need faith, and that's how complex systems work most effectively. And I think, again, in the context of COVID, we've seen some really interesting change in relationships between citizens and government. I was actually part of a webinar series recently with Penny Hagen and Angie Tangiare from the Auckland Co-Design Lab. And they spoke about how in Auckland, they observed that in the context of lockdown, particularly some Maori communities and iwi stepped up and filled the role that government couldn't fill quickly enough because they held the relationships. And Penny actually described what she said, we walked backwards into different ways of sharing power with community, because government found itself asking these community groups, how can we help you? How can we support you? And giving them freedom and autonomy because they held the relationships that mattered most in that context. So the question is that we ask in the essay is, how can we embed a relationships first approach in government? And then the third sort of pillar or element of our reimagined government is around how you make progress. And again, it's linked to the other two. And in complex environments, the only way you can make progress is through experimentation and learning. So concepts like a 10-year plan just don't work in complex environments, because every intervention changes the system itself. It's like if you throw a rock into a pond and it has the ripple effect. That's what every intervention does. And so to think that you can say, if we design this intervention, this will happen, is just not true in complex environments. So what we need when we're working in complexity is small interventions, a real commitment to conscientious observation of the impact that those interventions have, committed reflection, and then really thoughtful iteration and adaptation. So it's quite a different way of working to what public servants and governments are used to. And the question is, how can we make that more mainstream? So thankfully, we don't just have questions. We've also actually got some examples of governments around the world that we at CPI have started working with, who are experimenting with these new approaches. And we call this a human learning systems approach. So it can be contrasted to a new public management paradigm. And it's a version of government, of public management, which embraces these ideas that I've been speaking about. So I think a great example of a government that's been really focused on the human side of things has been Wigan Council in Northern England. And under Donna Hall's leadership, what she did was she recognised the absolute criticality of strong relationships and strong trust between government and citizens. And so she committed to training every frontline worker. So this was at a local council level. So police officers, social workers, in ethnographic methods. And what this did was it enabled them to have different kinds of conversations with the citizens with whom they were working. And it taught them to listen differently as well. And in addition to teaching ethnographic methods, what the council also did was they stripped away a lot of the restrictions and frameworks that they normally put in place, which really restrict how governments can interact with citizens. So they pursued a very relational form of government where a social worker was able to walk into a person's house and have a conversation about how they were feeling and then respond to that based on how that individual was feeling, rather than based on a sort of set list of programs or services that they were able to prescribe. In terms of learning, my colleague John has been doing some really interesting work with some local councils, again in the UK, on how they embed learning in their day-to-day approaches. And he's been using learning pods, which are very simple, but it brings together people who don't normally work together to have weekly conversations about what's gone well in their week, what's not gone well in their week, and what they might do differently next week as a result of what they've learned. So even small rituals and processes like that, the local council staff who John's been working with have just valued that enormously as a sort of way to reflect and improve on their own practice. And at a much grander scale, in Finland, at the decree of the Prime Minister, a program of work called Experimental Finland was rolled out, where experimentation was really promoted as an approach that all government departments should be using across all of their thinking and work. And then finally, we're also starting to see some work on governments who are trying to think more systemically. So I've been doing some work here in Australia with the Australian Tax Office around a question of system stewardship. What does it mean for the Australian Tax Office to act as a steward of the tax and superannuation ecosystem? And another project that I read about on the weekend that I thought was really interesting was a project being led by the UNDP in Bhutan on youth unemployment, where what they're doing is a whole lot of very, very small interventions in recognition of the fact that youth unemployment is a complex, wicked problem, and one or two grand interventions is generally not going to be effective in tackling what is necessarily such a complex issue. So just to conclude, one of the reasons that we're really excited about being invited to participate in this conversation today, and I guess to have this conversation in the New Zealand context, is because a lot of the initiatives that I've just described have succeeded in spite of the system in which they're situated. And what we're starting to see emerge in New Zealand with things like the Living Standards Framework and the Public Services Act, which has just passed through Parliament, is some of these ideas around a broader sense of well-being, you know, what it means to live a good life. Ideas like a systems leader, which is enshrined in legislation through the Public Services Act. We're starting to see some of these ideas take hold at the highest levels of government. And so what we're interested in exploring is what is the version of public management that you need to translate those high-level visions into tangible action on the ground. And we believe that new public management, which is obsessed with KPIs and outcomes and measuring things, is the wrong way to go about achieving that grander vision. And so we're really excited, and I guess for us this is hopefully the beginning of a conversation around how this human learning systems approach might be applied in a context like New Zealand. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much. I mean, that was such a rich presentation of your thinking. And yeah, I was while you were talking, I was thinking about where to start, and I might actually start with systems thinking that you outlined. And in essence, I think it's the importance of taking relationships and interactions of different actors and factors, determinants, activities, situations into account when designing responses to a certain challenge. And And I think that's quite fascinating, because we have a question here around the silo mentality that in a lot of countries, including New Zealand, is sometimes hard to overcome between the different departments of the public service. So, and if relationships are so important to actually get that, to get an overview of the entire system, how can we deal with the silos that we have created in order to overcome that and actually take a more a broader view of the situation and be more effective in handling the challenges?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and there are definitely structural barriers which get in the way of working like this, and there's no question that that's the case. I've been reading a lot about change at the moment and thinking about this question of how do you drive change, and for us at the Centre for Public Impact, should we be focusing our efforts on going from the top and sort of really pushing hard for structural change, for changes to the way that government agencies interact? Or should we be thinking about change differently? And I think that, I don't know the answer, obviously, but where I've landed is on the idea of change from the edges. So there's a great Rebecca Solnit quote which says, change tends to happen at the edges. The centre is rarely a place of generation. And I think that Donella Meadows, who's written a brilliant book on thinking in systems, also talks about paradigm shift happening when you don't waste time with reactionaries. That's what she says. You find your coalition of the willing, you show what's possible, and then the rest ultimately falls into place. So I guess the question that I think we need to ask is, how can people within the existing paradigm, in recognition of the fact that there are silos, start to think more systemically about their work? And I think there are ways to do that. So I think cultivating relationships with people in other departments, that's one of the big things that came up in the work that I've been doing with the ATO around system stewardship. What does it mean to be a system steward? One of the important things as a system steward is to have a broader perspective than your own little patch. And one of the insights that emerged was that people enormously valued just the personal relationships that they held with people in other parts of the department, because they were able to pick up the phone and have a conversation. How do you feel about this? How does this sit from your perspective? And so I think that, micro innovations like that can actually be quite powerful. So I think that thinking systemically can happen at different levels, and people can do it at a very small level in thinking about their own work, even if it's only within the field of education or only within the field of health. You can still start thinking about the impact of your policy or service in relation to others. And through starting to talk about those kinds of things, think in that way, have conversations with other colleagues, it starts to shift in a very small way, but not insignificant way, the ways of working and the ways of thinking, which is a really critical part of the ultimate transition. And I should say as well, this is not change that can happen quickly. It's a slow burn process, and it's about chipping away through individual practice, team practice, branch practice, and then ultimately, at a high level. But I think also, like the work that Peter Hughes has done on thinking about how to start to tackle some of those siloed structures is really interesting, and it's only just passed through Parliament. So, the vision to action piece is still an active question. But I think you guys are ahead of a lot of the world in having a piece of legislation that puts collaboration front and centre.
Yeah, thank you. You've talked a little bit about the importance of the top and the edges, as you called them, And I'm just wondering how community organizations can drive change so that human learning systems actually better inform government as well. And you touched on that briefly in your chapter in terms of, I think, participation, for instance, but it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, so I think that the role of communities is really critical to this. But I think that communities are limited in what they can do until government starts listening to them differently, and seeing its relationship to communities differently. So at CPI, we've spoken quite a lot about the idea of sharing power. So what governments are very good at is consultation, inviting communities to give their opinions, and then who knows where that goes, and who shapes the nature of the questions that are asked to communities, what they're allowed to provide input on and what they're not. And what our challenge is back to government is this needs to go beyond consultation, because communities is where knowledge sits, it's where resources lie, they're huge assets, and local place-based work is where the most change happens in addressing really entrenched problems. And also what works in one place almost necessarily won't work in another. And so our sort of challenge and our version of reimagined government is a version of government which, like I said, doesn't see itself as having the answers to offer communities, but actually gives communities a platform that the resources, whatever it takes to enable communities to thrive, to build their own assets, and to create a sort of a culture and an environment in which people can live good lives. That's how government should be thinking about its role.
You're also talking about the learning mindset, and you touched on that briefly, but I'd like you to make that a bit more explicit, because I think how we nurture that learning mindset is really critical. And we have witnessed under a situation of urgency like COVID that it is possible to apply a learning mindset, but I guess it is very challenging under more normal circumstances, if you like, to deal with the uncertainty that arises with it, with the time pressures that come with the need of doing things quickly. And it also I guess it requires an attitudinal change as well, which is probably the most difficult to achieve. But if you could outline maybe that learning mindset and how we can actually implement and realize it, when we don't have an urgency like now, would be fantastic.
Sure. So I think a learning mindset is often just the way that Toby Lowe, who's done a lot of work on this, often talks about it, is in contrast to an accountability mindset. Or accountability for outcomes. So he says, the way that we've set up government and the way that we sort of measure success in government is we define outcomes, which was seen as an improvement on defining outputs. But we define outcomes like we want to lower rates of obesity, for example. And then we measure success against that, and we do that by defining very specific KPIs. But the point is that in complexity, in complex adaptive systems, when you predefine outcomes and measure KPIs, then what happens is you get some really perverse behaviours. So I always like to think, it's a really crude example, but I think it's a really powerful one. Say your outcome is reducing homelessness, and the people who are working to achieve that are told your success is getting homeless people off the streets. That's it. Theoretically, they could shoot homeless people and bury them. and be rewarded for that because they've gotten homeless people off the streets, which is, of course, absolutely not what that outcome was intending. And so what we encourage is an approach where people describe a sort of an end state that they want to move towards at quite a high level, like people live fulfilled and flourishing lives, and then constantly review and adapt and refine the path that we're taking in order to get there. So that sounds quite esoteric. I think that a really practical way that that's starting to happen in government is through a concept called developmental evaluation. I'm not sure if people have heard of that, but it's recognizing that sort of articulating a theory of change or whatever at the beginning of the project and then running it for 2 years and then doing an evaluation at the end is actually not the most effective way to achieve change. And so through developmental evaluation, which government agencies are starting to experiment with, evaluation and learning is actually built into the program of work. So every week you're reflecting on, are we heading in the right direction? If not, why not? Is this KPI causing us to behave in ways that actually aren't that desirable? And therefore, do we need to reframe that KPI or leave it behind altogether and find a new KPI? And so it's building this process of learning into the project and not seeing the fact that a particular KPI isn't being achieved as failure, seeing that as learning and using that learning to inform how you adapt the program to actually get to the end point which you wanted to get to in the first place.
There was actually another question that we got from one of our participants around how we measure progress and actually how we measure what we intend to attain. So if the evaluation is inbuilt, if it's, coming while we are doing, or while the evaluation is done while we are doing the project, it seems like it would be almost never ending, right? Because adaptation is endless and there is no perfect solution, I guess, and it changes with the determinants that impact on your project. So how would you answer that question? How do we know that we are actually where we should be as per our objective or our goal? That's challenging, isn't it?
It's really challenging. And I think, I've been thinking about this a lot, and we've been debating this a lot within CPI because it's taxpayer money and it's a democracy, and how can we do away with accountability and outcomes? But the more I think about it, and it's really hard, I'm still grappling with this, but we actually need to accept that there is no endpoint, that's by its nature what complexity is, and that we're creating fictions by saying, I mean, a wicked problem by its definition can never be solved. So you're never going to solve a problem like obesity or homelessness. And so what you need to be doing is Donella Meadows says, dance with the system. And it's really uncomfortable for us to hold that uncertainty. But I think the answer was in your question, Andrea, which is that it never ends. And once we start to internalize that and accept that and stop thinking in linear ways around this is the beginning, this is the end, this is success, then we're done, and in much more iterative, cyclical, systemic ways, then we can actually start to reorient towards this new way of thinking and being.
Maybe a really nice analogy is what you mentioned earlier, the gardener, because a gardener is never done. A gardener, continues to garden, and there are, depending on season, you can harvest their flowers are in bloom, and you see the successful moments, but those are just moments, and then you move on again, and you need to pick up the work again and maybe readjust how the soil, or you have to cut parts of the plant and so on and so forth. So maybe that's kind of a very reiterative process where, yeah, you have success from time to time that is visible. Other than that, it is, you know, tracking on and making progress overall in the garden.
I think that's
I don't know if that's
right.
appropriate.
No, that's exactly right. And I actually wrote an essay on that, using the garden analogy to explore the idea of complexity in government and what that means for how we think, for how we design policy, for how we lead. And, you know, leadership happens at all levels of the public service. And I think gardening is a really powerful analogy, and the way you've just described it is spot on. But it's hard to fathom. You know, it's so not in keeping with what we're used to, and it's in, you know, measurement changes and accountability changes, and this is challenging stuff for us to get our heads around. But the reality is that the measures and approaches that work really well for complicated problems. So this is not saying that you know, that those kinds of metrics and approaches are never okay. They are okay when what government is dealing with is a complicated problem. But what we do is we apply that approach to all problems, and that's not working.
I would also like to briefly touch on the idea of a human-centered approach. We hear that quite a lot, I guess, these days. And what we also hear, especially, you know, within government programs or policies, is the idea of a client or customer-centered approach. Is there actually a difference, or you know, is a client and customer-centered approach sufficient in actually reorienting government and the way we do things?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that, so I was part of this webinar series that on reimagining government, and that's where Penny and Angie spoke. And we had our final one last week, where Ken Smith, who's the head of the Australian New Zealand School of Government, spoke about these ideas that we're talking about today. And he actually said, which I thought was a really interesting framing, he said, the money that government has is not the government's money, it's the public's money. And the public is the consumer. And businesses do everything to orient around what the customer needs and wants. And government doesn't do that at all. And what we need is a radical reorientation of government to see its responsibility as to serve its customer and meet the customer needs, or consumer, because he said, you know, ultimately it's their money, which I thought was really, really interesting. I think that, you know, often human-centered design as a concept goes into places and ideas that conversations around customer centricity don't. So human-centered design, for example, talks a lot about power dynamics, and it might talk about issues like systemic racism or institutional racism, because a lot of the challenges around the way that government thinks and does things is that it's oriented towards a certain way of seeing and understanding the world that may not reflect the reality of the people who are consuming the services or relying on government to deliver certain things to it. And so for me, I think Ken's point was a really valid one and a really powerful one and quite radical. But I think the language of human-centered design, rather than sort of the language of consumer and customer, starts to bring in some of these, you know, I don't know what you'd call it, maybe deeper issues around the way that we think and design interventions to support people.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to close with one of the questions from one of our participants, and the question is around, you know, what or where is the fertilizer? And I think that's up to the point, because we face expectations, I guess, that things are delivered quickly and improvements are made quickly, and you know, certain services are needed, you know, yesterday rather than tomorrow as well. So how do we deal with that challenge of time pressure? And this is a challenge that has come up many times in the webinars before, especially if you want to engage in rigorous citizen and community participation and engagement. It simply takes time.
Yeah.
So I would be very interested in, yeah, hearing how you answer the question about the fertilizer.
Yeah, so in terms of, well, it's interesting because I interpret fertilizer a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. And I would say the answer to the fertilizer is what is the fertilizer? It's the people. Because it's you know, so, well, the people are the gardener, actually, aren't they? Okay, I'll think a little bit more about that one. But in terms of the question around time, I think, again, the answer depends on what problem you're trying to solve. So if you need to get PPE out to all medical people, you know, that is not time to consult. And that's not a complex problem. It doesn't need a shared power approach. You just do the thing that you know you need to do to pump out PPE, and absolutely that is the appropriate response. And speed and agility is absolutely necessary there. In terms of community consultation, it's hard because it is slow. And to do it properly, it needs to be slow. And political cycles are short and don't support that way of working. But I guess what I would point to is examples of it happening, again, as I said, in spite of those barriers. So in Australia, there's some really long-term investments, like 10-year investments in Logan Together, which is a whole of community, they call it a collective impact project, which is around early childhood development and raising the quality of early childhood outcomes and education and health in Logan. There's another example called Burnie Works, which is around unemployment in Burnie in Tasmania. And so there are examples of these slower burn, very community-oriented, place-based work happening. I guess the question that we're asking ourselves that came out through the webinar series that I was involved in is why are we still seeing little pockets of this happening, and what needs to happen to take it mainstream? And, you know, unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that yet. I think part of the answer may lie, as I said, in having a government at the very highest levels starting to think about these questions and talk about these issues, as it appears to be the case in New Zealand. But we don't have the answers to that yet. And I guess that's part of the mission of CPI, is how do we take these examples of the gardening approach to governing and doing public services, and how do we spread that more widely across the world, really?
And I think you went back to the differentiation between a complicated and a complex problem. And that is probably the very first step that everyone in the public and community services needs to think about. Which problem is it? And then depending on that, you apply, so if it's a complex problem and a lot of interrelationships and interactions are involved, then you need to apply a human learning system. If it's a complicated problem, you can adhere more to certain steps that are provided and timeframes, and also traditional measurements, I suppose, of success. Whereas with a complex problem, it would it would be an incremental developmental evaluation that you need to apply in order to measure success. So I think that differentiation is probably quite important for a person working in the public and community services to apply what you just told us and to reorient government or the public service from where they are.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, I've also had this conversation with my colleagues at CPI, and there's different, you know, different opinions about that as well. And I saw someone just put in the chat that there's problems which have bits that are complicated and bits that are complex. So Adrian Brown, who co-authored the essay, said that the more he thinks about it, the more he thinks that the vast majority of problems are complex. So I think that's a live question as well. There's actually a really fantastic essay, which I can share with Kirsten afterwards to share with the audience members, because I've just forgotten the name of the author, but where she sets out really, in really accessible, clear terms, the difference between complicated and complex. She's a great writer in that field. So really happy to share that afterwards.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. Thank you so much. And I think we are getting to an end, although it feels like we can talk, you know, at least another 45 minutes about complex and complicated problems and gardening and fertilizers and learning and human beings and systems, and it's fascinating. Thank you so much, Thea. That was a great conversation. I greatly enjoyed it, and I hope our participants did so as well. If you did, please share the information about the webinars, the webinar, also the chapters with your friends and family and colleagues, everyone who might be interested in this. The webinar will be up on our website in a couple of days, so you know, you can rewatch it as well if you like. And our next webinar will be on the 26th of August, so next Wednesday, with Mike Joy, and we are going to discuss the future of environmental regulations. So that should be another really interesting one. And yeah, I think there's not much more than saying thank you and stay well.
Thanks, Andrea.